The summer of 1854 was hot in the way that the Nebraska Territory was always hot in summer, which was absolutely and without apology, the sun coming down on the flat country around the North Platte River with a weight that pressed everything low and slow. The grasses along the river bottom were tall and green in the bottomlands and pale and dry on the higher ground, and the great emigrant road, the trail that tens of thousands of settlers had been traveling west along for more than a decade, cut through all of it like a scar that refused to heal. The wagon ruts pressed so deep into the earth over the years that they had become a permanent feature of the landscape, as much a part of the terrain as the river itself. Fort Laramie sat in this country with the particular posture of a military installation that has been placed somewhere it did not organically belong, its adobe and timber walls representing a version of order and authority that the surrounding land did not acknowledge or share. The fort had begun as a fur trading post, had passed through various hands and purposes, and had been purchased by the United States Army in 1849 to serve as a way station and administrative center along the emigrant road. Its garrison in the summer of 1854 was not large, a few companies of infantry and dragoons, a collection of officers ranging in quality from adequate to poor, and the usual population of support personnel, traders, and hangers-on that accumulated around any fixed military presence on the frontier. The Lakota Sioux, the Oglala and Brule bands in particular, camped in large numbers in the country around Fort Laramie that summer. This was not unusual. The fort had become a node in a complicated web of relationships between the United States government and the peoples of the plains, a web formalized 2 years earlier by the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851, which had attempted to establish territorial boundaries between the various nations of the plains and had guaranteed annuities, payments in goods to the tribes in exchange for allowing safe passage of emigrants along the trail. The annuities were the reason the camps were near the fort in late summer. The goods were distributed annually, and the bands gathered to receive them the way people gather for any expected and important transaction. The Brule camp of a chief named Conquering Bear sat about 8 miles east of the fort along the north bank of the North Platte, a substantial camp of several hundred people in the late summer heat, going about the business of waiting with the particular patience of people who have learned that the things they are waiting for arrive when they arrive and not before. The camp was orderly in its own terms, the lodges arranged in the traditional pattern, the horses grazing on the river bottom grass, the daily life of a large and established community moving in its accustomed rhythms. Conquering Bear was a man in his late 40s, known to the American authorities as a principal chief of the Brule, though his actual authority was more nuanced and more constrained than that designation implied. The political structure of the Lakota was not a hierarchy in the sense that the American military understood hierarchy. It was a web of relationships, obligations, reputations, and negotiations. And a chief's ability to act depended on persuasion and consensus rather than command. The Americans had, in the manner of people who need to deal with a complex system and find it inconvenient, simplified this into a structure they could interact with, designating certain individuals as chiefs and treating them as possessing an authority. Those individuals did not actually hold over their own people. Conquering Bear understood this gap between what the Americans thought he was and what he actually was, and it was a gap that would matter enormously in what was about to happen. The incident that ignited everything began with a cow. This is one of those historical facts that seems, from a distance of more than a century and a half, almost too small to be true, the idea that a cow could be the hinge on which a catastrophe turned, but history is full of small things that open into enormous consequences, and the cow was only small in the sense that it was one animal. What it represented, the collision of incompatible understandings about property, obligation, sovereignty, and law, was not small at all. On the 18th of August, 1854, a Mormon emigrant party was moving along the trail past the Brule camp. The party had with them a lame cow that had been struggling for days, falling behind, becoming more liability than asset. Somewhere in the vicinity of the Brule camp the cow strayed, or was allowed to stray, or wandered because it was lame and tired, and animals in that condition do not exercise good judgment about where they go. It entered the Brule camp's periphery, and a young Minneconjou Sioux man named High Forehead, who was visiting the camp as a guest, killed and butchered the animal. This was, from High Forehead's perspective and the perspective of many in the camp, not a complicated matter. The cow had been abandoned or had strayed. It was available. It was food. The precise nature of property rights over a struggling emigrant cow at the edge of a Lakota camp was not, in High Forehead's framework, a question with the answer the American authorities would insist on. The Mormon emigrant, however, went to Fort Laramie to report the theft and demand compensation. This, too, was not complicated from his perspective. Property had been taken without consent, and he expected the fort's authority to address it. At the fort, the matter landed on the desk of the commanding officer, a man named Hugh Fleming, who was young and uncertain and operating in circumstances that required more experience and judgment than he possessed. Fleming sent for Conquering Bear and discussed the matter with him. Conquering Bear, in the diplomatic and careful manner that had characterized his dealings with the Americans, offered various forms of compensation, horses, goods, for the cow. He explained that High Forehead was not one of his people, that he was a visitor, a Minneconjou, and that his authority over this individual was limited. He offered what he could offer. He could not simply produce High Forehead and hand him over because his relationship to High Forehead was not one of command, and also because the concept of surrendering one of his own camp's guests to a foreign authority to be punished according to foreign law was not one that existed in any form he could present to his people as reasonable. Fleming accepted none of the offered compensation, and the matter remained unresolved. At this point, a more experienced commanding officer might have taken the compensation, considered the diplomatic reality of the situation, and found a way to close the incident without escalation. The cow, in any reasonable accounting, was not worth what was about to happen, but Fleming was not the one who would make the next decision. That decision was made by a man named John Grattan. John Lawrence Grattan was 4 years old, a second lieutenant who had graduated from West Point the previous year and had been at Fort Laramie for only a matter of weeks. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him, possessed of an abundance of confidence in his own abilities and a corresponding deficit of respect for the people he had been sent to deal with. He had expressed, on multiple occasions and to multiple listeners, his opinion that a small detachment of regular army soldiers could easily defeat any number of Sioux warriors. This was not an unusual opinion among officers of his generation and background. It was the opinion that a particular combination of cultural arrogance and military inexperience tended to produce. But it was also wrong in ways that the next 24 hours would demonstrate with absolute finality. Grattan went to Fleming and actively volunteered, to take a detachment to the Brule camp, demand that High Forehead be surrendered, and arrest him if he was not. Fleming, whose own judgment was not functioning at its best, agreed. On the morning of August 19, 1854, Grattan assembled his force, 29 enlisted men, a howitzer, a mountain howitzer, and an interpreter named Auguste Lucien, whose qualifications for the role were questionable and whose state on the day of the mission would later be described as having involved a substantial quantity of whiskey. The column moved out of Fort Laramie along the river road toward the Brûlé camp with Grattan at its head, young and confident and moving towards something he did not understand. They arrived at the camp in the afternoon. The camp was large, several hundred people, and around it and through it, the full life of a substantial community going about its day. Grattan positioned his men and his howitzers at the edge of the camp and sent for Conquering Bear. The chief came and they talked, with Lucien interpreting in a fashion that later accounts suggested was neither accurate nor sober. Grattan repeated his demand: High Forehead must be surrendered. Conquering Bear repeated his position. He could offer compensation, but he could not force a Minneconne, you guessed, to submit to arrest by American soldiers, and even if he had the authority to compel such a thing, which he did not, the act itself was one that no man in his community would accept as legitimate. The conversation went in circles because the two positions were not actually reconcilable. Conquering Bear was not being evasive or deceptive. He was describing a real constraint. He did not have the power to do what was being demanded of him, and even the power he had was not the kind that operated by command. Grattan was not hearing this because he was operating from an assumption that a chief was like an officer, that an order given to the top of a hierarchy traveled down through it automatically, and that Conquering Bear's failure to produce High Forehead was therefore a choice and a provocation, rather than an accurate description of how authority actually worked in this community. High Forehead, for his part, was not hiding. He was in the camp. He knew what was happening. He said, according to accounts, that he would not be taken alive, and that if they wanted him they would have to kill him, which was a position whose straightforwardness was at least consistent. The negotiation, such as it was, lasted perhaps an hour, possibly longer. The specifics of how it ended are not entirely clear, because the people who survived it told different stories, and the people who were most centrally involved in the critical moments did not survive to tell anything. What is clear is that at some point Grattan ordered his men to open fire. The first volley hit the lodges near where the negotiation was occurring. Conquering Bear was struck, wounded severely, a wound that would kill him within a few days. The sound of the firing and the impact of the shots on the camp, on lodges, on ground, on people, produced an immediate and total response from the Lakota warriors in and around the camp. What happened in the next minutes was not a battle in the sense that the word implies two organized forces engaging each other with some equivalence of capability and preparation. Grattan's 9 men were in the middle of a camp of several hundred people, surrounded, having just opened fire, with a chief of significant standing lying wounded on the ground. The Lakota response was overwhelming and immediate. The warriors Oglala had joined the camp and were present in numbers, moved with the speed and coordination of people fighting on their own ground, defending their own people, responding to an attack that had been made on them in their own space. Grattan's men tried to withdraw. The howitzers had been fired. There are accounts suggesting they overshot the camp or failed to deploy effectively, and the soldiers were on foot in terrain they didn't know, surrounded by people who knew it completely. The withdrawal became a rout, and the rout became a catastrophe. Within a short time, accounts vary on how short, but it was not long, Grattan and all 9 of his men were dead. All of them, every soldier in the detachment. Grattan himself was found afterward with multiple arrow wounds, his body identified with some difficulty. Lucien, the interpreter, who had been drunk before the first shot, and whose translations had helped produce this outcome, was also dead. The only person who might have survived long enough to reach the fort road died before getting there. The killing of Grattan's entire command sent through Fort Laramie and then through the broader American military and government system the kind of shock that institutional bodies experience when something happens that their prior assumptions had categorized as impossible. 9 regular Army soldiers with artillery, defeated completely and immediately. Not one survivor. The assumption that a small detachment of American troops could overawe any number of Sioux warriors had been tested against reality and had not survived the test. But the shock did not immediately resolve into understanding. The narrative that formed in the American press and in official communications about the incident was not a narrative of a poorly conceived and poorly executed military intrusion into a Lakota camp that had ended the way such an intrusion might reasonably be expected to end. It was a narrative of massacre, the Grattan Massacre, the name that entered the historical record, in which soldiers on a legitimate law enforcement mission had been treacherously attacked by Indians who had agreed under treaty to peaceful relations. The framing placed the violence at the beginning of the Lakota response, rather than at the beginning of Grattan's column leaving Fort Laramie. Conquering Bear died of his wounds in the days following. He had come to meet an American officer to negotiate a disagreement about a cow, had offered compensation that any reasonable accounting would have accepted, had explained with patience and accuracy the limits of his authority, and had been shot for it. His death moved through the Lakota world with the weight of a terrible and clarifying thing, a thing that told a story about what American authority meant on the plains, about what the treaties meant, about what the future held. The Brûlé camp dispersed after the killings, the people moving north and east away from the river road and the fort. Among those who left was a young man who had been in the camp that day, a teenager whose father was Oglala and whose mother was Brûlé, who had watched Conquering Bear fall and had watched the soldiers die and had understood something from the watching that settled into him with the permanence of things understood in the body rather than only in the mind. His name at that time was something that would be translated variously, but he was a person who would be known to history as Crazy Horse, and what he witnessed at the age of roughly 13 or 14 on that August afternoon along the North Platte would shape the understanding of American authority and Lakota response that he carried for the rest of his life. The American military's response to the destruction of Grattan's command took almost a year to materialize in force, because the machinery of American military response moved slowly in mid-19th century, requiring the movement of orders and troops across distances that took months to traverse. The response, when it came, was commanded by General William Harney, a man whose approach to the situation was shaped by neither nuance nor negotiation. Harney was sent to punish the Sioux, and he understood his mission in those terms without qualification. In September of 1855, Harney's force encountered a Brûlé camp at Ash Hollow, also along the North Platte, a camp led by a chief named Little Thunder. The camp contained many people who had been nowhere near the events of August 1854, and were not implicated in anything that had happened. Harney's attack on the camp killed approximately 86 people, including women and children, and captured more than 70, mostly women and children. The attack was celebrated in American newspapers as a victory and a restoration of order on the plains. The people of the plains understood Ash Hollow as something different, as the demonstration of what the American understanding of punishment actually meant in practice, which was that it did not require the culpability of those punished, only their presence in a category that had been designated as requiring punishment. This understanding was not abstract. It was written in the bodies of the dead at Ash Hollow and it was remembered with the specificity and permanence with which communities remember the killing of their people. The Grattan incident and its aftermath traced out the essential logic of what was happening on the northern plains in the 150s with a terrible clarity. The United States government and military were operating from a set of assumptions about authority, about sovereignty, about the meaning of the treaties they had signed, about the capacity of military force to produce the political outcomes they desired, that were not matching the reality of what was happening on the ground. The Lakota were not a people who could be managed by the mechanisms the American government was deploying. They were numerous, mobile, skilled at warfare in their own terrain, and governed by internal logics of obligation and honor that the American system persistently misread. The treaties were particularly revealing in this regard. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 151 had been understood by the American signatories as creating a set of legal obligations that the tribes were now bound by, obligations that American courts and military could enforce. The Lakota understanding of what they had agreed to was different. They had agreed to certain behaviors in exchange for certain payments, but the agreement existed within a framework of ongoing relationship and negotiation, not as a fixed legal code administered by an external authority. These were not the same thing, and the gap between them kept producing incidents like the one at the Brûlé camp, where American officials arrived to enforce obligations that the people they were dealing with did not understand themselves to have undertaken in the form being invoked. The cow at the center of all of it had a value contemporary accounts suggest of somewhere around $10. Conquering Bear had offered horses worth considerably more. The Mormon emigrant had lost an animal that was lame and struggling, and might not have survived the journey in any case. None of these facts entered into the calculation that Grattan made when he formed his column and marched it out of Fort Laramie on the morning of August 19th, because Grattan was not making a calculation in those terms. He was making a calculation about authority and demonstration and what it meant for the United States Army to be present on the plains, and the calculation was wrong in every dimension, with consequences that extended far beyond him and far beyond the 29 men who died with him. The years after Grattan and Ash Hollow saw the northern plains enter a period of escalating violence that would not find its culmination for another 2 decades, at the Little Bighorn in 1876, where another American officer with another set of assumptions about what soldiers could accomplish against Lakota warriors received another answer to the same question. The line from the North Platte in 154 to the Little Bighorn in 176 was not straight. History's lines never are, but it was real, traced in the accumulated injuries and responses and understandings that each episode left behind in the people who survived them. Crazy Horse survived and carried what he had seen at the Brûlé camp for 22 years, until the morning in June 1876, when he helped lead the attack on Custer's command at the Greasy Grass. Little Bighorn and the American 7th Cavalry was destroyed with a completeness that recalled the destruction of Grattan's detachment, the same overwhelming response to the same intrusion into the same people's territory, the same gap between what American officers believed they could accomplish and what the country and the people in it were actually prepared to let them accomplish. The Grattan Massacre, as it was named and as it was remembered in American accounts, was the moment that revealed how completely the two worlds occupying the same physical space had failed to understand each other. The American world was telling a story about progress and law and the extension of sovereignty over a territory that was being opened to settlement, a story in which the indigenous peoples of plains were either obstacles to be removed or subjects to be managed, in which treaties were legal instruments creating enforceable obligations, in which a lieutenant with 29 soldiers and 2 howitzers could walk into a camp of hundreds and demand the surrender of a man accused of killing a lame cow and expect compliance. The Lakota world was telling a different story about the land they had lived on for generations, about the agreements they had made and the terms on which they understood themselves to have made them, about the obligations of hospitality and the impossibility of surrendering a guest, about a chief shot down while trying to negotiate in good faith, about soldiers who had come into their camp and opened fire on their lodges and killed one of their leaders and been met with the response that any people would make to such an action in their own home. Both stories were being told simultaneously in the same place about the same events. The inability of either side to hear the other's story, not merely disagree with it, but actually hear it, understand it, recognize it as a story being told by people who believed it as fully as each side believed its own, was the condition that made the violence not only possible, but, given enough time and enough incidents like this one, essentially inevitable. The cow wandered into the Brule camp and was killed because it was there and food was always useful, and there was no shared understanding in place that would have made the act obviously problematic to the person who committed it. A young lieutenant marched 29 men into a situation that his assumptions had prepared him entirely wrong for. A chief who had been designated by the Americans as holding authority, he did not actually hold in the form they needed, tried to navigate between 2 incompatible demands, and was shot for the failure of that navigation. 29 soldiers died, a chief died, a camp scattered, a general was sent to punish people who were mostly not implicated in anything. 86 people died at Ash Hollow. The plains began a slow explosion that would take 20 more years to complete. The North Platte ran on through all of it, as it had before the emigrant road and would after, indifferent to the stories being told along its banks, carrying the runoff of a country far too large and complicated to be contained in any single account of what it was or who it belonged to. The grasses grew and dried and grew again. The wagon ruts deepened with each season's traffic, and then eventually, decades later, were overgrown when the traffic stopped. The fort that had sent Grattan's column east along the river road is a historical site now, preserved against the flatness of the Wyoming country, its walls and buildings maintained in a version of their old form for visitors who come to understand what happened there. What happened there was this: 2 worlds, sharing a geography, failed to find a language that could hold them both. The failure was not innocent. It was shaped by power and by the intentions of the more powerful party to expand into a territory it had decided it needed. But it was also not simple, not reducible to a single villain or a single act. It was the accumulated weight of incompatibility, the grinding of 2 different understandings of land and authority and obligation against each other until something gave way. What gave way first, on the 19th of August in the heat of a Nebraska summer, was a negotiation about a cow that had wandered out of a Mormon emigrant's possession and into the margins of Brule Camp. What gave way with it was whatever remained of the possibility that the story of the plains could be settled through the mechanisms the Americans had brought with them, treaties and forts and columns of soldiers and the authority of a government that the people of the plains had no particular reason to recognize as having authority over them. The plains did not explode in a single moment, though the name of what happened that day suggests a detonation. They exploded over years, in incidents and responses and retaliations and punishments and more incidents, the violence self, generating in the way that violence between peoples tends to do once first blood has been drawn, and the first stories of grievance have been told to children who will grow up to act on them. Crazy Horse grew up. The warriors of the Lakota Nation grew up inside a story that included conquering Bear dying of a bullet wound while trying to negotiate the return of a lame cow. And that story was not one that produced accommodation or acceptance. It was one that produced Crazy Horse at the Greasy Grass, and the dust of the Little Bighorn rising over the same kind of flat country, under the same enormous sky, answering the same question in the same way it had been answered 2 years before